And hello, everyone, and welcome to this presence episode as we continue on with science and spirituality. I am pleased once again to be here today with author Joe Masterleo, who has written the book Ambient Christ. We've centered our episodes on it. We wrap up today the 4th episode. Joe, good to see you today.
Good to be with you.
And you ready to go?
I'm all set.
Good. Well, I think what might be helpful for us as we wrap this up is for you maybe to give a recap of where we've been. We've been in 3 episodes. We've gone over a lot of material, maybe some main takeaways that you feel like in kind of a recap summary maybe that can get us ready for the final go of it today as we wrap up this subject.
Well, let me hit some of the highlights just to lay the groundwork for what we're going to finish with here today.
Yeah.
The book is one whereby I'm trying to put together a model that plausibly integrates science and spirituality. Trying to tell a new story. The subtitle of the book is The Inside Story of Science, Scripture, and Spirituality. Trying to tell a story that pulls a number of different elements together. And my theological platform is a Judeo-Christian one, as a lens into the infinite invisible that we've seen intersects with space and time and is the origin and source of the entire created order. Part of the Judeo-Christian framework breaks down, and this is an oversimplification of the human frame, the human person, as body, soul, and spirit. And each one of those elements, one of those categories, and they all interdigitate and overlap, have needs. The body has a need for food, clothing, shelter, air, sleep, safety and security, and so forth. Moving on to the next level, the soul also has a need, and it has a need for meaning and relationship. For those who are spiritually awakened, the spirit has a need for ultimate meaning. Now, with regard to the soul in its search for meaning, there are 2 categories that the person or the soul, the individual, experiences and looks for meaning. And it's the smallest dome. There's 3 domes I'm going to lay out here. There's my story. My story has to do with my life story, my journey, that which contributes toward me being unique as an individual. Genetics is a part of that. History is a part of that. Experiences are a part of that. Okay. The next largest circle of meaning for the soul, and we're not yet into spirit, would be our story. It's the context that people find themselves in: family, ethnicity, culture, nationhood, whatever tribe they might belong to religiously, whatever religion, whatever denomination, whatever sports team. Those are social contexts that give meaning. So we have my story, which is more individualized, and we have our story. Okay. Now, when we move into the spirit has a need for ultimate meaning. Beyond my story and beyond our story, ultimate meaning that, in my view, is larger than one's individual story or one's tribal story. And I like to call that one the story with a capital T. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now the problem is, under the title of the story, we have the creation story. There are a multiplicity of stories, but basically we have the creation story and we have the evolution story. And that's sort of been the case for a number of years, with scientists being in one camp and people in religion and spirituality being in another.
Mm-hmm.
East has been east, west has been west, and there has the twain met. Right. Sort of like oil and vinegar.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
I mentioned last time, after Darwin came out with his evolutionary theory, there was a man who was a scientist and theologian by the name of Henry Drummond, who thought there was no problem, that the two of them could fit together, and he wrote a masterful work called The Natural Law in the Spiritual World. Okay, but not much has been done since that time to put a model together that's an integrated one. Now, why is that a problem? Why can't they be separate? Well, they can be separate. You can discuss them as separate, but the word universe means a reality that turns around on one thing.
Yes.
The prefix uni means one thing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And most of the religions of the world say that God is one. In the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 6:5, the Shema, the Lord our God is one Lord. One God. Well, if there's one God and the universe, by definition, turns around on one thing, there's a problem, because we have two stories, okay, that have not been united. Now, I believe, and that's why I put the book together, that the dots are there to connect, that unite the two stories. I think God has given us special revelation, the scriptures, and he's given us natural revelation, nature and the cosmos. And I think he's arranged the dots in such a way, especially during, the last 20 or 30 years, where they can be connected plausibly to try and put these two things together. So what I did, and I'll reiterate what I said last week briefly, that I took a look at the scriptures, and I took a look at science, and I tried to find if there was a common universal element that stood out, that was central to both disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
And what struck me in a fairly obvious way was the common universal element, and the book gets into great detail here, I'm just hitting the highlights, is light. Light is a constant in the universe. That's well known in physics and in science. The constant in scripture is God. Okay. And so, in fact, the scriptures, one of the definitions the scriptures give to God is that God is light.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So, we have two constants here that are central to both, in a nutshell, to both stories. So then we should be able to take cosmology, which is the study of the origin and nature of the universe, which has been divided in two, scientific cosmology and religious or spiritual cosmology. The challenge, I felt, was to put together a theology that was a mixture of both, which there was a section in the book I entitled Cosmotheology, which we'll be talking about in a few minutes.
Yep.
Okay. But, and I'm going to refer to my notes here quickly.
Okay.
If light is the common universal element, I had written in my notes, it's the birthing place of all created energies and forms, being the substance of those forms at all scales of the universe. Okay, this constant called light is what we refer to in spirituality or religion as God, appearing as everything, everywhere, at the same time revealed and concealed, hidden in plain sight, if you will. This light or spirit, which in Colossians in 3 places is described as that in whom or in which all things consist and are held together, that which fills all things, that which is in all, that which is all and in all, and in which we live and move and have our being, Acts 17:28. Now that light is a singularity. The singularity means it consists, its substance is of one thing, it's undivided. But when it passes from the implicate or invisible order into the field of space and time, it refracts and diffuses the way light diffuses through a prism where you get the colors of the rainbow, the 9 colors of the rainbow. And so from a unified element comes multiplicity. Now, the book goes on to explain that there's an energy field that when light passes from the infinite invisible to space and time, it manifests as energy, okay, which I posited and explained in the book in detail as electromagnetic. I have a whole chapter on Tesla explaining the notion of electromagnetism. So it manifests as energy in electromagnetic form. It manifests as the architecture of the universe. And I did a whole chapter on Buckminster Fuller, who was an architect, and he studied the finer points of the created order that quantum physics touches upon. It also manifests as geometry. And I have a whole chapter on a physicist who has a unified field theory based on geometry. He and Einstein and others believed that geometry was the secret to understanding the unified field. It also manifests as mathematics and music. Now, with regarding mathematics and geometry, I focused on the Fibonacci sequence, particularly as it plays out, as that energy plays out in spirals. I call the spiral the fingerprint of the universe, because we see spirals at all scales from quark to quasar and all points in between. Okay.
Yes.
So basically, what we've covered up till now are those 6 components of how light manifests itself in a variety of ways: electromagnetism, the architecture, geometry, mathematics, music, and spirals in the universe. So we have roughly 6 elements. And today we want to cover the 7th, which is the fact that that this energy, as it manifests itself in space and time, evolves. And that takes us into a discussion of the paleontologist, theologian, Teilhard de Chardin, the French paleontologist, theologian. He was a philosopher, he was a mystic, he was a poet, he was a man of many talents. And he had he served as a stretcher bearer in World War II, volunteered for service because clergy at the time over in France were exempt from military duty, and he volunteered, and so he was awarded some commendations for bravery over there. And he did most of his research. He worked in the field studying paleontology, unearthing primitive man, trying to piece together an evolutionary sense of how the universe unfolded. And he had a model, which I can briefly explain, that unfolded. He saw the universe very much the way we see it today in science, it being 13.7 billion years old, beginning in an explosion of light and heat, and created, it, just went in all directions, expanded, and is still expanding. That view is consistent with the Big Bang Theory as well. So he saw the first stage as cosmogenesis, this vast explosion of primordial light and heat. And the next step in his evolutionary model was a geogenesis, the development of the Earth as an entity in space. And from the geogenesis, his ladder was biogenesis. There was, biology and one-cell plant and animal life began. And from biogenesis, it goes to anthropogenesis, meaning, the advent of primitive human beings. And then from anthropo to the development. At that point, he felt that natural selection or evolution favored the primates because there was a rapid development of the brain over periods of time based on some of these specimens that they unearthed, that the brain made incredible advancements over thousands of years, but in the spectrum of 13.7 billion years, it was fairly rapid. And so, and then from the flow of his model, from cosmogenesis right through, and we're up to anthropogenesis, the next step would be psychogenesis. He noticed the energy was becoming more convergent, more centralized, and more complex in the development of humans than in any other place in creation. And he posited that after psychogenesis, the highest stage would be what he called Christogenesis, that the converging of that energy from the scattered primordial beginnings, funneling itself down to man, became much more what he called interiorized, in one's interior, converged. The other term he used was it became cephalized, which refers to the brain, the advanced brain, which became complex, all in preparation for the latter end, which isn't just the psychological development of mankind. That's just the flower. The fruit would be the last stage, Christogenesis. So he had this sense of evolution that basically selected for the primates, particularly, mankind, and he felt that was evolving. Now, unlike Darwin, who thought all this happens exclusively by natural selection, Chardin felt that there was an added element that he called the elan vital, that there's a vital energy that's behind this unfolding that propels this energy. It's an invisible dynamic. Now, he didn't speculate on what that was, and he just mentioned that, similar to what Tesla was referring to when Tesla referred to prana. There was another term he used, which is often synonymous with ether, which they used back then. But they used as a term to explain this invisible substance of all form. But he said that he laid the groundwork and said, now this was a time before physics was developed, certainly before quantum physics. And he said that the day would come when science, he called it an ultraphysics or a hyperphysics, would basically understand what this energy is. That's the dynamic behind the evolutionary process, and that comes to fruition in a spiritualization of consciousness, which he called Christogenesis. And he I think more than any other person that I focused on in my book, he in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s pulled together some of these disparate threads in science and in theology. He was more of a scientist than a theologian, but he had a deep sense of God's presence, in a sense that science and spirituality, or science and theology, were basically two sides of the same coin. And he experienced quite a bit of censorship from his Jesuit order and from the Vatican for having written in his essays and in his books, which they did not allow him to publish. They were not published till after his death. He experienced quite a bit of censorship and efforts on the part of the prevailing systems that he was a part of to suppress his work. In fact, he was sent to a remote outpost in China to do his his paleontology because they really didn't want him making much noise with his trying to bring these two these two notions together, creation and evolution.
That's excellent, Joe. It's a great, first of all, recap. And then, of course, getting into the concept of cosmotheology. A couple quotes that I have here that I really like from your book is one quote is transdisciplinary and transreligious in scope. A global quorum of non-dual integration thinkers has become a gathering force in a progressive movement now approaching critical mass. This idea of trans-religious, and of course, Teilhard, a man for his time, had a lot of great thoughts. We're going to go talk a little bit about that and beyond in the next sessions. But this idea of trans-religious is really getting beyond the idea of coexist, which is what religions do. If you look at the bumper sticker on the back of cars, you see this coexist, and so what you have is segregated existing forms, if you will. And on page 281, you make this comment that the visible and invisible worlds, God and creation, do not coexist as two apples coexist. That what you're saying in your book is this is not about coexisting as two things.
No.
What you've shown is starting with light, all your recap, everything that you've shown is that we're talking about a unified universe, a unified field, a consciousness, a unity consciousness.
Yes.
That's what's making its way to the planet. And as you say, Teilhard saw that this was an evolutionary process.
Yes.
It's exactly what writers like Paul thought, because he saw it as the movement from the evolution of consciousness from childhood forward. So you have in both science and in the narrative, which again is now taking us and pointing us toward universal spirituality, not segregated and denominated religious forms. So that's what really excited me when I began to look at your work. It's truly talking about something that's just now manifesting on the globe. This is why people in integral theory have shown that we have just now reached a stage in this evolution where our brains are now picking up an integral perspective, whereas in times past, human beings were not ready for that type of worldview.
That's right. You know, the work that we're doing now, in my view, this is really what I was thinking when I was trying to put my model together. We really owe it to these pioneers like Teilhard and others that I mentioned in the book, that on whose shoulders we stand, because they've left us, they've taken the baton quite a distance, and they've left it for us to pick up and move forward in this grand synthesis of being able to be conscious and help others be conscious of how all things are one in unity.
Yes.
And to be able to explain how they're one. And Teilhard looked forward to the day when science would develop itself in ways that would make it possible to explain, that science and spirituality are incomplete in themselves as categories. In fact, they're competing partial truths that, from the standpoint of the infinite invisible or the quantum platform or spirit or God, there is no distinction from the standpoint of light. They're both facets of that same singularity, which makes no distinction between the two of them or any created thing.
Absolutely. And in fact, Joe, this is our challenge today, and why your work and those who are talking about integral concepts is so important. What's facing our planet today is always an us versus them mentality. However, that us versus them shakes out in beliefs and ideologies. And what the universe is telling us is that while it may appear at times on the surface that there are differences, those differences don't exist when we get to the essence of the human being, when
No.
we move from our manifested differences
That's
into
right.
our essence. That ambient that you have on the book cover
That's
coming
right.
out is where that energy dwells.
That's right.
That means that we are all interconnected, and we cannot write off another group. We cannot write off another part of the world. We cannot write off the poor. We cannot write off anyone because it affects ourselves.
That's right. That's right. Teilhard made a statement. One of the statements he made with regard to what you're just alluding to. He said the age of nations has passed. You know, meaning not that there's not going to be any nations, but
Right.
there's a way to conceptualize creation and human beings
Yeah.
as being one at the core, being part of this unified field whose essence and depth is spirit. Persons created in the image and likeness of God, whose essence and depth is spirit, period.
Mm-hmm.
That's the identifier. That's what he meant by that. Now, I would add, though some people would take exception with me, that you could add to that, not only has the age of nations passed or is passing in the sense of inhabiting a larger dome of meaning, growing from the limitations and the tyranny of my little story, which has its place in personal development, and the narrows of our story as a tribe or a nation or a sect or a sectarian group.
Yeah.
You know, moving into the story, the my story and the our story dissolve into that.
Yes.
You know, with growth and change and progression and personal evolution. And so your thinking becomes, you have a wider dome of consciousness, a broader, a sense of inclusiveness, greater compassion, greater tolerance. You know, you see God, you know, you experience God's presence and see God's presence everywhere, the more developed you become. And so those boundaries dissolve.
Yes.
And there's no need to defend them.
Right.
Because they're just temporary anyway.
Right. Well, and that otherwise, if they weren't, there would be no growth. There would be no evolution. The boundaries would become walls that would then become restrictive and prevent that growth.
That's right.
So, in essence, I realize, and integral theory talks about that, yeah, there's the egocentric, but if you stop with egocentric, you're purely, literally a self-centered person. There's ethnocentric, which broadens that circle out that you talked about. But if you stop with ethnocentric, then you have again segregated your tribal thinking into some particularity. And then, of course, the story that you're outlining moves us into world-centric. And that's where, even going all the way back to the genesis of the biblical narrative, you have this promise that through Abraham, all nations, all will be blessed. And that was the original kernel of potential that was within this evolutionary process from the beginning, and is now in exciting times, really, for us, that we're even able to have a discussion like this today, Joe, that 100 years ago, no one was even having this discussion 100 years ago.
No. And Teilhard was a visionary, and he spoke of that endpoint as the omega point.
Yeah, talk a little bit about that as we kind of wrap up our episode here. Where are we headed, Joe? Tell everybody so we can know before we leave here today. Give us some details on where we're headed.
Where I believe we're on, as a globe, we're on the cusp of what Teilhard referred to as the omega point. Now, you call in the scriptures, Christ identified himself. I think it's in the book of Revelation. I am the Alpha,
Yes.
the beginning.
Yep.
I am the Alpha and the Omega,
Yes.
the beginning and the end,
Yes.
the first and the last.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, in personal psycho-spiritual development, if a person, goes from my story to our story context, which are normal in development, and continues to grow and realizes that there's more to those two domes, there's a third dome under which those two domes are subsumed. You move into the story, you realize you're part of a larger context that everybody else, whether they're aware of it or not, occupies. And in personal development, if your spirituality blossoms and you mature, you have that consciousness. And so that has been attained, not on a large scale, but that's been attained throughout history. It certainly hasn't happened yet globally. In fact, Christ said, when it does happen globally, then he'll come back. It's associated with basically his return.
Right.
Okay. So what am I saying? What I'm repeating basically is what Teilhard is saying, that evolution itself, in the broader global planetary sense, is moving in the direction where the thinking envelope of the planet, the consciousness of the planet on a wider and wider scale over time, and this is what you were referring to, is Teilhard called it the noogenesis, that is moving in the direction of that Christogenesis on a wider scale. That's the omega point. That's the end point. The end and the beginning are basically the same places. We came from that place, and it's as if developmentally and globally, it's a circuit. We're returning to that place, only in a different way. After going through all these various forms and transitional metamorphoses, okay, it's as if it's a circuit.
Yes.
And I think we start out, we come from light, and we end up as light beings.
Yeah.
And that's why in my last chapter one of my last chapters called the Omega Point of Spirit, I kind of picked up the baton where Teilhard left off and kind of pulled the book together in all of its various parts, the way light manifests itself in a multitude of ways, kind of coming full circle. Sort of like the object in baseball, the hitter starts out at home plate and makes a journey around the bases.
Yes.
And he ends up where he started.
Yeah, exactly.
if he's safe, but from a different angle and
Right.
after a number of way stations, or if you want to call them that, developmental phases, where back home again. So I see, and I think we share this, Doug, that the next stage in evolution is going to be on a more planetized scale. Not sure when it's going to be, but it's headed that way.
Right.
Is going to involve the energy centrating itself more and more condensed and powerful forms and manifested in spiritual consciousness. I think that's the only way the planet is going to be salvaged, because the biosphere is not in good shape. And certainly in this country, people can't be any more divided than they are, nor can religions and the traditional boundaries that people keep, that they feel they have to defend and feel insecure, are going to be taken away from them.
Yes.
So I see this heading in a direction where you and I have spoken about the fact that whatever that metamorphosis is, it's going to be a little different. It's going to be less a change in degree than it's going to involve a change in kind.
Yes.
That at the root of our being, our essence and depth, we're light beings.
Yes.
and light workers who are conscious of the fact that things seem to be unfolding in that direction. And there are pockets of us around the world, as you know, that seem to be coming to this place at the same time. You know, the First Axial Age, which happened, I think, somewhere between 800 and BC and maybe 200 AD, all around the world there were different unrelated pockets of places where religions began. Cultures began to realize that there was a transcendent element to creation. And it all happened in that relatively short period of 1,000 years. You know, the philosophy developed in Greece, the religions, came about, Islam, the Hindu religion, the Far Eastern religions. The thinking envelope of the planet, the consciousness of the planet, recognized there was a transcendent element, to our existence. That was known as the First Axial Age.
Right.
Axial referring to, what our beings are centered on. And I think we're pretty much into the second axial age, where there's this awareness that, okay, every camp has a sense that we have a transcendent aspect to our being. Now, what do they all have in common? Okay, we need to take this sense of transcendence a step further in ways that are more inclusive and more unifying.
Well, that's a great summary of what your book is trying to get across, which again, bringing us into this idea of the next step, where we're going, how do we evolve. The good news with when people maybe get a little bit discouraged or a lot discouraged about the particular country they're living in, the difficulties in their country, the difficulties in the life conditions, is a necessary part of evolution. Again, what spiral dynamics calls the unworkable. And that when we human beings encounter the unworkable, we know it. And we know what there is this energy that we are, this light that we are, that is not functioning. It becomes dysfunctional, and we feel that, we know that. And I believe that's why we have an innate hunger and thirst after rightness or righteousness, which is this way forward. So I'm an optimist when it comes to where we are headed, because I believe that this transcendent that you referred to, that which is transcendent of even what we understand, what we are here as human beings on the planet, is the force and power of evolution. And that much as I may think otherwise, that's headed a direction and a trajectory that's gotten us to a place today where we're talking about really big things in a unified way. So any final comment you'd like to make before we wrap it up here?
Well, I wanted to mention briefly that the indigenous cultures of the world, though they don't use religious terms as we refer to them, they don't use the word Christ, but they understand, when you study them, what they all have in common is that they understand that they're, and this is my word, of course, but that there's an ambient spirit that inhabits all things, peoples, plants, air, water. It's all around us. And it's conveyed in their own stories and songs and mythologies on the interrelatedness of all things, called the web of life.
Yeah.
And so it's not like this is a new concept. In some ways it's new to, how ordinary people think along categorical lines. But for spiritually conscious people and spiritually informed people and in indigenous peoples, this has always been the case. The simple things are the most profound.
Yeah.
And I think that any unified model, this is why I try to put a model together for future generations to work from, that let people know where I think we're going, and that the basics of which can be taught to a middle school child. Of course, it gets more sophisticated, but the basics of the spiral dynamics model and the spiral model that I propose in this book is really quite simple.
Yeah.
I mean, you can elaborate on it, but the basics of it are simple. And I think that would be the only thing I would add.
Well, that's a great thing to add. It's a great note to encourage everybody to go get the book from Joe Masterleo, The Ambient Christ. Joe, it's been great having you for these 4 episodes, and I just want to say how much I appreciate the years of work and research that you put into this, and your willingness to do that work so you could share all of this really valuable information with everybody. So thank you for everything you did there, Joe.
And I want to thank you for the privilege of giving me these 4 segments so that we could have an exchange and, broadcast this to others who are, interested in the big picture beyond my story and our story into the story in a way that integrates what appear to be separate and siloed fields.
Beautifully said. Love it. This is the presence message, and we sync up beautifully with what Joe is saying and the insights, the many insights that he's brought us in the cosmotheology that he has outlined in this field. So thanks everybody for joining us. If you have any questions, send them to presence at info@presence.tv. We'll be glad to answer them. And I'm sure that Joe will be continuing on in other ways as we at Presence continue to think about a day when we might even be able to have meetings somewhere and go outside of our house. That's an exciting thought. But anyway, thank you to Joe. Thanks for everybody for watching, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.